Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we are going to talk about pessimism. And is there an upside as well as the proverbial and famous downside? Can it be a self-fulfilling prophecy, or is it an example of the classic hope for the best but prepare for the worst? How does it tie in with other kinds of difficulties like anxiety or depression? And how might it be useful as a motivator in people? So here we go. There's a lot to talk about here. So I'm very optimistic about our discussion today about pessimism.
Well, this is going to be a little hard for me because I think that optimism is one of my most persevering traits. So,
well, at least that's true for one of us.
Oh. Yes, well, good morning, Eeyore. Welcome to the podcast. You know, what I'm thinking about is I know that I tilt toward optimism also, and I'm aware that sometimes it's a defense. Mm-hmm. You know, I really don't want to see the downside. It would be really disappointing and awful. And,
upsetting, scary.
Mm-hmm. So look on the bright side. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking that pessimism can operate as a defense, but it might also be a very objective, even cold-eyed ability to assess reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we don't want to see it, so we call these people pessimists when they're really realists.
I think that's a very important point because in the self-help community in the United States, probably for the last 20 years, a kind of defensive, wild optimism about one's ability to create anything and to command the universe to respond to one's needs is so inflating that this pessimistic idea that, life is difficult and that suffering is inevitable feels like a reasonable compensation.
Yeah, this kind of, manifest what you desire and positive psychology and all this stuff. Being a little bit of pessimism might just give us what we need.
A kind of medicine that doesn't taste so good, but it might actually get our feet on the ground and get us relating to some of the things that really are difficult that we have to embrace.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about it as a motivator. I think motivation may boil down to, what gets you moving. Is it the carrot or is it the stick? And maybe the optimists are more carrot-oriented and pessimists are more sort of stick-oriented. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be some combination of both.
So being motivated by pain versus being motivated by promise is how I'm thinking about it, yeah? Mm-hmm. So I guess if one has a pessimistic attitude as a core attitude, the expectation would be that pain is going to be the motivator. And if there isn't pain, perhaps then there might be a stuckness or an inertia. And so if we're looking at the suffering or the possible catastrophes in life and are mobilizing in response to seeing it, then in a sense, we're kind of being driven by the stick.
Yeah, and perhaps even being driven by fear, I think. I mean, it doesn't sound like such a great way to live to me. Always trying to hedge against some catastrophe and prevent some terrible outcome. I mean, certainly we need to think that way sometimes, but if that's the only place we ever spend any time, it sounds rather dreary.
Or it could be a kind of stoicism and a willingness to experience the suffering, that this is my life right now. Maybe it's a slog through the swamp, and there are alligators in the swamp, and all kinds of other dangers in the swamp. and that I accept the reality of that rather than seeing the world through rose-colored glasses of, pretty soon, we'll get out of the swamp and everything will be glorious. We'll be at Disney World and we'll have so much fun. That I can see that the acceptance of what is might be part of the pessimism of things are tough right now.
It strikes me that we have kind of gone back and forth in the conversation so far between these positions of, a little pessimism could be a good thing. It could be about acceptance. Optimism could be a good thing, or it could be a defense. It seems like what we're talking about, as we often are, is this place where we're holding the tension, right?
Yes.
And that there's a place for pessimism. But I wonder if we should dig in a little bit more and kind of define this. Like when we're talking about pessimism as a real characteristic in a psyche, a kind of core attitude, what does that look like and how do we understand that?
What comes up for me, just first of all, is the etymology from Latin that it means pessimist is the worst, and that it can be kind of an absence of hope. That I don't expect to ever get out of this metaphorical swamp that I'm in.
Or whatever the situation is, I always expect the worst.
Mm-hmm.
Well, expected or are looking for it. So in the etymology of the word pessimism, in the beginning of it is the Latin word ped, which means foot. And the implication is that there's always something that's willing to trip us up. Always there's a stumbling possibility in the idea of pessimism. Now, if somebody, let's say, were to, go on a road trip from, New York to, Los Angeles, one could orient to the trip, keeping an eye on what's going to trip me up. There's inevitable stumbling places that are constantly, opportune during this long travel. And I'm going to be scanning the horizon for the places that I might have a problem. Now, I don't know that that is inherently better or worse than any other attitude. It really depends on what the mood or emotional reaction to what you're looking for. So it doesn't necessarily have to be miserable to be looking for the stumbling places versus traveling from New York to LA and looking for the exultant aspects of it.
Right. Anticipating the problems can be very adaptive, right?
Yeah, particularly if somebody is neutral about it.
And I think that's at the bottom of it is what is the feeling and the felt attitude of if one is anticipating, I could get a flat tire, I could run out of gas on some long stretches of road. That's one thing versus the cognitive distortion possibility, which is, oh my God, this is fraught with danger. There are highwaymen who could, come riding out of the forest, and that's a cognitive distortion. And I'm also thinking about the feeling state of, is one filled with trepidation and a lot of anticipatory anxiety about all the things that could go wrong, or is it adaptive?
And I think that when we're talking about pessimism, though, we are probably referring to the latter state, where we're not only looking for everything that could go wrong, but we're more focused on it, and it affects our mood and our outlook.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if we think about it in the social context, we'll take something like smoking, that, there was a time where everybody was smoking all the time. I remember going to my pediatrician's office, and this was probably 1966, maybe, to get, a little shot in the keister because I had an ear infection. And I remember my Dr. Bauer, this wonderful German woman, with a cigarette hanging off her lip, puffing away as she's bending me over her lap to give me a nice big penicillin shot in the keister. That, smoking was everywhere. Doctors were smoking, and smoking was thought to perhaps even relax your lungs. Smoking was even being suggested for people that had asthma, early on. And that there had to be finally a pessimistic attitude, which is if you smoke, you will kill yourself. That if you smoke, you will end your life, or your life is going to be truncated in some fashion. So this idea that the worst case scenario will be tied to certain behaviors actually can be life-saving as well. Now, people who are addicted to smoking and then they're hearing this information could easily want to push it away and decide, oh, I don't want to think about that negative stuff. I'm going to be optimistic. I'm going to be one of those people that isn't affected. After all, my great-grandmother smoked for 40 years and she lived to be 98. It's a tricky line. Is it pessimistic to think one is going to shorten the lifespan by smoking? Or as Deb had said, is it an adaptation to reality, and that the tension that one feels about the pessimistic attitude actually is the stick that mobilizes people towards change?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it can be adaptive to reality to admit that bad things can happen. And I think I'm interested in exploring more of the psychological state where we're always looking for the bad thing, where we perhaps ruminate on the bad things that can happen, where we have a tendency to catastrophize, and where that really becomes a set attitude or a way we move through the world and a dominant mood.
I hear you, Lisa, and I agree that pessimism is often really sort of associated with a kind of depressive.
Exactly, yes.
Do you want to do this? No, I don't know. I think it might rain. Well, then how about if we did that instead? No, I don't really want to do that. I think it just would just be too much trouble to organize it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then how about if we did this? No, I'm just really tired today. I don't really feel like doing anything. That it can really impede relationships with people. It can with work, with colleagues, and the relationship of a person with him or herself.
Well, and it affects our energy for life, doesn't it? What Jung called the libido.
Yes.
I mean, and I don't know, it might be a chicken or an egg problem here, but if you constantly, Deb, in your little hypothetical example there, everything that's offered, you immediately think, well, what could be wrong about that? What could be bad about that? Then you might never leave your house, and you don't have a lot of energy to go do things.
So there's a potential link with a kind of depressive attitude and a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that if everything's, there's no point, it's not going to turn out well, then it won't. If you don't leave the house and you don't engage and you don't do these things, then life becomes a kind of dreary affair.
Mm-hmm.
So in that description, it reminds me very much of just depression in general, that in the face of this litany of possible negative experiences, the person cannot rouse the libido to want to move forward, to want to do anything, because they have that kind of affective response. But I still in my heart feel like pessimism and this idea of always having the stumbling places aware in the forefront of my mind, for some reason, I don't think that inevitably leads to depression.
Oh, no. And I didn't say that it did. I mean, I think you can be looking for the stumblings and prepare for the stumblings and still go do the thing. And you'll probably have a better trip because you anticipated some of the things that could happen.
Or certain doctors specialize in pathologies. So what they're doing is they're looking at all the data that a person comes to them with in a medical context, and they're constantly looking for what's wrong. What's broken? What's wrong? Where is the sickness? Where is the problem? And I have to say that I kind of move through the world often in that way. I am fascinated by the idea of where is the broken place? Where is the sick place? Where did things go wrong, or where are they going wrong? And there's something fascinating about finding the broken and the wrong place.
And I think that can be a really powerful way to move through the world, because you're anticipating problems and perhaps very oriented towards solving problems. I think pessimism carries with it the connotation of something that's a little more maladaptive than that, which is anticipating the problems and looking for it maybe when it isn't even really there, and then tending to fixate there in a way. It's one thing to look for the problem with an eye toward preventing or solving the problem. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of pessimism looks like there's a problem and I'm just going to give up, or there's nothing I can do.
So I think we're looking at distinguishing pessimism from cognition and anticipating problems, like your trip from the East Coast to Los Angeles. What could go wrong? Okay. And then mood, of whether that feels like we're going on the trip and we're just going to see what could go wrong and prepare, versus, oh my God, this is going to be such a drag. Oh my God, it's going to be fraught with danger. That kind of loss of libido and seeing the world through sort of charcoal gray lenses.
You know, there's another psychological concept that comes up here that I think is, Joseph, you've already kind of referenced Eeyore here today, is this idea about locus of control. If we see that there's a problem and we have an internal locus of control, that is, we feel like we can affect the outcome of things, then we're going to anticipate a problem. We're going to try to prevent it. If we see a problem, we're going to try to fix it. That's a very empowered stance. If we have an external locus of control and we tend to see problems, we're going to be more likely to say, well, there's going to be this problem and there's nothing I can do about it. And that can lead to a kind of paralysis in the worst case.
It can, if one believes that the solution would be to act on the problem. Like, for instance, I'm thinking about Camus. Most of us in high school read Camus' book, The Plague, which was an introduction to absurdist philosophy. And so Camus, surmised that in the face of an absurd universe that one cannot control, that is likely to do horrible things, like in his book, The Plague, a city gets walled off and this horrendous disease begins to sweep through the population. It feels inevitable and horrifying. It can't be escaped. Camus thought, well, one could choose suicide and just kind of end the whole operation. One could move towards a kind of transcendental ideas to kind of rise above it. But what he recommended was to accept the absurdity of life and yet to continue to live in it in spite of it, and in spite of the fact that it couldn't be changed, that the universe isn't going to respond to the particular demands that we have. And so for Camus, the place is meaning making, that we can't change the stage 4 cancer diagnosis, or we may not be able to change the reality that we're going to die and that everybody we love is going to die. So where perhaps even Eeyore in the Winnie the Pooh series is that he assigns meaning to things, even if the meaning is a little gray, even if the meaning is a little fatigued and frayed at the edges, but his capacity to decide that things have a meaning for him is what Camus would say allows us to put one foot in front of the other, which and our moving feet might not be full of joy or enthusiasm, but they can be full of meaning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which feels a little bit different to me than pessimism. I think I'm thinking of pessimism as a tendency to kind of ruminate and perseverate on the negative in this way that's in a way that might accomplish some things, like perhaps be a defense or be a way to avoid meaning making and to kind of stay with the neurotic suffering. But I think it just presents a little bit differently than what you're describing, Joseph.
I'm back on what you mentioned, Lisa, about where the locus of control is, because I think that's really important. And that even for your example, Joseph of Eeyore, who makes meaning, even if it's sort of a kind of gray universe that Eeyore lives in, he's made meaning of it. And Jung says we can bear almost anything if we make meaning of it, if it has, some kind of sense internally for us. But if we don't have a sense that we've made meaning or that we have control, I think then the external locus of control makes us hopeless. And I think that's very strongly associated with pessimism. It's hopeless. It doesn't make sense. There's not a lot of meaning to it, and there's nothing I can do about it.
And in the face of that, the question is, what happens to the human spirit? Mm-hmm. So, Lisa, Deb, what you guys are holding on to or bringing forward is that you might imagine that would create a kind of collapsed, depressed, difficult place to move from. And I guess I'm coming in from a slightly different side, that it might do that, or something in the spirit might rally.
I think what we're avoiding here is the feeling tone. I've brought it up a couple of times. We are somehow defending pessimism as versus, it's not fun to live with a pessimist. And it's often not good for them. There really is low libido. It's much, much more than what you're talking about, Joseph, which is very cognitive. Look for the shadow. Let's figure out where the broken place is and then try to understand it and be curious. There's a lot of libido in what you're portraying as your own pessimistic attitude, which is healthy, curious, energetic, and a willingness to enter the shadow. Versus pessimists are downers. And we're avoiding the depressive, hopeless, sodden. It's not invested with libido.
But we don't have to be polarized. Why don't we just say that there are a number of different ways to orient towards pessimism? And that, pessimism is at its core looking for the worst or knowing the worst or focusing on the worst. But to assume that there is automatically one effective response to it. So I'm saying I can validate it. Yes, some percentage of people, when they look at the worst, it just paralyzes them. And I'm coming on the other side saying, yes, that's true. And some people can look at the worst and actually find it fascinating and deeply engaging. And all I'm saying is that it's all true. It's that it's not just one way or the other.
Look, I want to go back to the feeling tone and get off this sort of positive, negative, anticipating, well, the worst could happen, et cetera. Sure, it could. And you can be curious about it and be invested with libido about it, like the road trip of these bad things could happen, but we'll just anticipate them. That has energy and problem solving and really an undercurrent of optimism. And I am interested in sitting with how tough it can be to sit with someone who is pessimistic, whose mood is down. There's no optimism, there's no energy, there's no problem solving, and it's just sort of life sucks. It's always been this way. It always will be this way. There's no meaning in it. I can't do anything about it. That is a real downer, and it's not, when we see it in the consulting room, it's not good for that person. That's why they're there in our offices.
I mean, I think maybe sharpening up our definition a little bit. For me, when I think of pessimism, I think about someone who not just can imagine the worst that's going to happen, but who actually just defaults to believing that the worst will happen every time. And so there can be this kind of learned helplessness of I'm just not even going to try because I just am assuming the worst is going to happen.
So that takes me to, your phrase learned helplessness of the experiments that they did with dogs of when the cages had an electrical current running through the bottom, the dog couldn't escape and finally they just gave up. And then they would open the door to the cage and the dogs wouldn't leave. And that is a very sad, painful example of learned helplessness.
And some people that we see in our consulting rooms are absolutely struggling with that. that they've had so much trauma throughout their lives of one kind or another, that it does really feel like the worst will always happen and there's nothing that they can do. And that does put you in a collapsed situation. I don't think that pessimism always comes along with learned helplessness. I think it can be related to typology, which is something we haven't talked a lot about on the podcast, but was one of Jung's ideas. And I think some people that are intuitive can tend towards pessimism, because one thing that can happen if you're an intuitive is you tend to just see the whole picture. And if you have a kind of negative intuition, you can just see all the bad things that are going to happen. They just appear before you. And if you combine that with a tendency to get stuck on those negative outcomes and relate to them as if they're inevitable or if there's not much you can do, then it kind of translates into pessimism, I think.
When we describe pessimism that way, to me, we're kind of back in complex theory. People who are pessimistic in this way, that it leads to a collapse and a lack of ability to move, often in my practice, they have a particular category that they go to very frequently, that the catastrophe is always going to end in poverty, or the catastrophe is always going to end in, loss of loved ones, or loss of status, something like that. That it does seem to be fairly categorical. And in that way, we're leaning into, what were the early life experiences? What are the potentiated images around, let's say, this idea of poverty being inevitable? And so in that way, it's kind of just a repetition of this historical experiences moving forward.
I really appreciate your bringing that up, Joseph, because I wonder about the relationship between maybe a tendency towards pessimism or even catastrophic thinking and a negative mother complex. Because I think that if we've had good enough mothering, often what comes along with that is just a basic security that the world will meet our needs. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how well this works maybe, but perhaps if we really felt like we just didn't get our needs met in childhood or emotional needs, that would tip us toward this always anticipating the negative.
I'm thinking in this context of a psychologist named Melanie Klein, who hypothesized that sometime in the toddler period, that the separation that, again, is hypothesized that infants and very young toddlers make is we have the good mommy and we have the bad mommy. But there's a real compartmentalization in a very young toddler's mind, and that all of a sudden, at some point in development, there is this realization that she called the depressive position, that good mother and bad mother are the same person, that it's not a separate thing, that my mom can be both of those things. And that the depressive position is a place where the child can accept really basic humanity in the caregiving parent. And I'm wondering if this may have a tie-in with pessimism of a real inability to hold the both, and a veering toward the early disappointment that may carry through and become a pessimistic attitude in adulthood.
What I'm sitting with, Deb, is, well, first that image that if the early parenting environment is either non-responsive, neglectful, and or, produces a lot of pain in the child, then that becomes a worldview. And I do think that that's a burden in as much as it's not realistic, that everything doesn't lead to catastrophe, neither does everything lead to bliss. So there's a way in which we're kind of skewed away from perhaps what's real. But I also think in Klein's work that the depressive pole was also considered medicinal, that for her, the manic position was the problem, and that accepting the depressive potential of things actually was curative.
Absolutely, it was, that this was a necessary stage of development, that the child develops the ability to hold both of those things, that things can be bad and things can be good. And I'm just wondering about whether if is a history of a lot of early disappointments, relational disappointments. If what happens is that it's sort of too much medicine, to use your word, Joseph, and the tilt is toward the negative, and insufficient ability to be optimistic, energetic, hopeful, and to feel that you have some control over your own destiny.
And I think that there's a lot of research, just to kind of put this into the mix, that we are wired as a species to look for and anticipate the worst. And of course, we remember negative experiences more strongly. And we're always going to be sort of scanning the environment for danger. I mean, in some sense, this is just how, this is how we survived. So we might all be hardwired a little bit toward pessimism, and that might be a good thing. It can be good for survival. Also, I believe there's research that shows that although pessimists are less happy than optimists, they are actually more oriented to reality and better at discerning, truth, as it were.
But I'm still back on what the internal experience of the pessimist is. Is there enough joy? Is there, even if it's a sort of looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, we all have meaning-making structures. And what is it that gives one's life some zest, sparks curiosity, a spirit of adventure, all kinds of things, versus maybe an overly adaptive reality orientation that makes life a bit of a dreary slog.
We need a little sparkle.
Mm-hmm.
we need a little pixie dust.
Well, we need energy for life.
I'm aware, Deb, sticking with the internal world, that sometimes pessimism, or a tendency to kind of expect the worst, can be defense. It can be a way of staying small. When we feel big, when we feel expansive, excited, proud, that can actually feel very vulnerable. Those are good feelings that sometimes are difficult to stick with because they make us feel vulnerable. So sometimes it can become a habit to keep ourselves small, to cut off from feelings of, wow, isn't this great that this happened? And focus, something good happens. I don't know. Let's say that your kid just got into college, and you could either be really excited and, wow, this is great. And, she's going to college and this is great. Or you could flip into a place of like, oh my God, how are we going to pay for it? Which of course is a real concern. But there's a choice about how to orient to that. And it might be that the choice to perseverate on, oh no, college loans is a way of disconnecting from the excitement, because the excitement makes us feel too big, and that's a vulnerable feeling.
So we talk a lot about holding the tension of the opposites, and the issue is how to hold both of those things. Mm-hmm. Your child has gotten into the college of his or her choice, and that's really amazing and wonderful. And whoa, now we have to figure out how we're going to make those tuition payments. I'm also thinking about pessimism as a defense against disappointment. And I think disappointment is much, much bigger than, sort of the polite thing of, oh, I'm so disappointed we can't come to your party. It's become kind of a hallmark word. Of disappointment has, as you were saying, Lisa, if you're big and you're up there, it's real loss. It's real sadness to really be disappointed. And we defend against just feeling disappointed and sad and grieving it. We do all kinds of things to make meaning of it or rationalize it, justify it, tell ourselves it doesn't really matter. Pessimism, if you never hope for the best, you'll never be disappointed, and you'll never have to really sink into sadness.
Then it's what Jung called neurotic suffering.
Yes. That neurotic suffering is an inability to truly suffer, and so we attach it to something that we can bear, something where we can displace our feelings onto. something that isn't quite real. So anyway, I'm thinking about pessimism as a defense against sadness and upset and distress, that it can be better to feel pessimistic than it can to have to experience more intense feelings of fear and loss, abandonment, and overall distress.
I mean, I think that there, as we have been oscillating between, there obviously are some positive aspects of pessimism. I think that's what I was kind of alluding to before about the research. I know in my own life, I happen to be partnered with a first-rate pessimist. And although that is tiresome at times, there definitely are instances in which he perceives something that I didn't see or I didn't want to see that, helps us make kind of better global decisions. I think the pairing, that my optimism adds something and drives him crazy, and his pessimism drives me crazy, but also adds something.
Yeah, I like your bringing it into the relational field, Lisa, and the oscillating between polarities that takes place in couples, as well as just intrapsychically between, let's say, me and me, that people hold those polarities, and if it can be productive, there's room for a creative solution.
So what this brings up for me is the myth of Daedalus and Icarus, and the need for this balance of the incredible exaltation of the son and this much more pessimistic attitude of the father. So this is recounted in Ovid's Metamorphosis. Daedalus is longing to return to his native soil and creates these miraculous wings made of wax and feathers as a way of trying to winging himself back to his homeland. And he's mastered them, and he's able to have this extraordinary experience, and his son sees it, and he wants to share it with his son. So he makes a pair of these wings for Icarus as well. And then he gives this very important advice and says, "Let me warn you, Icarus, to take the middle way, in case the moisture weighs down your wings if you fly too low, or if you fly too high, the sun scorches them. Travel between the extremes. Take course, I'll show you." So he lays down these rules for how to pay attention to these pessimistic alternatives that can happen as a way of making sure that his son is both safe and successful. And so we have this balance, which is a little bit similar to what Melanie Klein was talking about, the manic attitude of euphoria, which Icarus is holding, and then this more depressive, sober, saturnine accommodation to danger, which Daedalus is holding. And of course, we all know that Icarus becomes inflated and joyous and flies higher than he should, gets too close to the sun. The wax melts and he falls into the ocean. And Daedalus then has this awful task at the end of the tale looking for his son's body. But those are the two polarities, I think, that are in all of us, that we can get too swept away in the euphoria of something new and exciting, and we can lose sight of perhaps a much more useful pessimistic attitude.
Yeah, I think that that's a great illustration, actually, because it certainly takes an amount of boldness to think about flying. And we all need that. We all need a little optimism to get up off the ground. If we're too pessimistic, we fly too low and our wings get sodden. But if we don't have enough pessimism or enough, as you put it so well, Joseph, kind of orientation to danger or orientation to reality, we get in trouble in the other way.
And I imagine from Icarus's standpoint that his father's advice was a downer, that he didn't want to feel anxious, didn't want to feel depressed about these dangerous components, and so decides to minimize them or ignore them. Optimism can be as much of a defense against the actual existential dangers of life as pessimism can be a defense against disappointment.
Absolutely.
And I'm aware in this tale that Daedalus does hold the middle way of the realistic aspect of pessimism that is a great adaptive mode. But if Icarus had been a truly pessimistic young man, he could have disobeyed his father and flown too low. Okay, I'm not taking the middle way. I'm only going to fly 15 feet above the ground so that if I crash, I don't get hurt too badly. And that kind of pessimism would have resulted in disaster also.
Yeah, Daedalus's advice reminds me of the hypothetical that you guys were discussing earlier in the podcast about this trip from New York to LA. You'd better think about all the things that could go wrong. Absolutely. You probably won't get there if you don't.
But to be truly pessimistic would be not to go at all. And that's a real defeat. So I like the story of the middle way, of how do we fly and take the middle way.
And that reminds me of just some nuance about the etymology of the word pessimism, that it's one thing to be looking at one's feet and to be attending to stumbling blocks. It's another for the foot to be caught and stuck in the root and held there so that we can't take a step forward.
Yeah.
And so the pessimistic attitude can be an attitude that's reacted to in a number of different ways. Yeah. And we're most concerned when it becomes a paralyzing trap.
And I have a really wonderfully silly fairy tale about that I'll just share a little bit of. It's an English fairy tale called The Men of Gotham. And there's a wealthy farmer who's married, and he has one lovely daughter. And one day a gentleman happens by, and because the daughter is so charming, he proposes to her, and everyone's very excited about this. And so they send the daughter down to the basement to get some ale. And she's in the basement filling up the ale when she looks up and she sees an old axe stuck in a beam. And she thinks to herself, when the gentleman and I are married, what if we have a son and the son comes down here and the axe falls on his head? Oh no, that will be so awful. And she just sits down and she starts to cry. So when she doesn't come back upstairs, the mother comes down and says, "Oh, what happened? Why are you crying?" And the young woman says, "Well, the gentleman and I get married, we have a son, and the son comes down here and the axe falls on his head and he dies. What will happen?" And the mother said, "Oh, that's terrible." And she sits down and she starts to cry. So the father comes down next and they tell him and he starts to cry. And eventually the gentleman is like tired of waiting for his drink. So he goes down there and he sees the three of them. The ale is running out of the spigot and he sees the three of them weeping. And they explain it to him. He says, you are a bunch of old sillies. And it goes on from there. The fairy tale goes on from there. But it's that attitude of sort of, and again, I think of that as that kind of negative intuition, that you just have this image of the worst thing that can happen. And then it paralyzes you and you stay stuck there and you don't have the ability to climb out of that perspective and weigh, is this necessarily going to happen? Is there anything I can do to prevent it? Which would be very adaptive to think about it like that.
You could pull the axe out of the ceiling, for example.
You could pull the axe out of the ceiling, right.
I was wondering if that's the end of the fairy tale, that the gentleman finally just pulls the axe out.
He does pull it out, and then it goes on from there, but yeah.
Yeah, a little common sense can sometimes go a long way.
But, the fairy tale does show that when we're in that collapsed place, which I don't know about you, but I've been there, you don't think about pulling the axe out. And I think that's when we've been sort of possessed by this attitude or overcome by it or kind of drowned in it, is that we don't see the options and we can't even make a judgment about how likely it is that this might happen. We tend to catastrophize.
So we get caught in a complex of our own making that sometimes has no relation to the external world situation at all, as your fairy tale really dramatically illustrates, that it's silly.
Yeah. I used to have this great quote that I would share, and then I found out that it's actually not. I always attributed it to Mark Twain. Apparently that is apocryphal, but it's still a good quote. It says, "I've had a lot of problems in my life, and some of them have even happened to me."
That's marvelous. Well, I suppose it's time to go to a dream.
Okay, let's do it. Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work, but producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you.
Today's dream comes from a dreamer who is a 32-year-old woman, and she is a college student. For additional context, she also wrote that she has worked as an exotic dancer for 5 years and has been feeling extremely unfulfilled and unmotivated at work, but continues with it because this is the kind of work that is familiar to her. And here is the dream. I was flying through a futuristic city. On the ground below me, I saw a small model or replica of a stadium and circled above it several times. It felt familiar to me, and I thought that I had seen it in other lucid dreams of mine. It felt like an important sign since it was showing up again, so I wanted to investigate it more in this dream. In my mind, I thought to myself, may I understand the wisdom of this art piece. When I flew down to the ground to get a closer look, I saw what looked like a children's book lying there. I picked it up and tried to read the cover and flip through to see what was on the pages. The text was blurred, as though I wasn't wearing my glasses. I squinted and moved the book further away and closer to me, trying to get the words in focus, but the text remained blurry. I felt thwarted and began to cry with frustration. I cried, God, why do you put this here for me if I can't read what it says? At last, I was able to see the title somewhat more clearly and repeated it to myself again and again in the dream in order to remember it when I woke up. The title of the book was The Fullness of Round Objects. And for some context, she says she's been feeling overwhelmed, stressed, and depleted as the semester progresses. She's recently returned to college to pursue a career in nursing, and it's been about 10 years since she graduated college with a first degree in a different field. The main feelings in the dream were fascination, excitement, frustration, and upset.
I'm thinking of the progression here of the images in the dream of the city, a kind of symbol of a wholeness and culture that's created, and then a stadium, which is also a contained structure. Then she sees it as an art piece, then a book, and then the book entitled The Fullness of Round Objects. And roundness, circles, is a kind of containment. And I'm thinking of it in the context of her returning to her career that she's pursuing in nursing as something that would feel fuller to her than this career as an exotic dancer that she dislikes but is doing because it's familiar and remunerative, presumably. It feels like the telos or the trajectory of the dream is taking her toward this book and symbol of roundness, wholeness.
Well, and I noticed that she begins flying through a futuristic city. So there's this question maybe about whether or not she's escaping something, kind of up in the clouds. And I agree, Deb, these images of kind of roundness and wholeness are certainly pervasive in the stream. It does seem like she's really looking for something.
Yeah.
And she does manage to get on the ground. And then she almost utters a prayer.
Yes.
God, why do you put this here for me if I can't read it? Or, may I understand? So she's really in a kind of supplicant position to the self, we might imagine, of help me understand this and get through this, and is rewarded, I think, at the end with this interesting title.
Yes, I think the dream is much about developing that religious attitude that in this kind of puella place of flying and lucid dreams, and people who are very focused on lucid dreams often deprive themselves of the autonomy of the unconscious because the ego then is much more in control of the message. But the fact that, as you'd mentioned, that her interest, her curiosity is what leads her to kind of abandon this transcendental flying over and be involved in what's happening in the real world, in her real world. And she's led back to childhood. So often, as analysts, we can work progressively or regressively. Jung often preferred the progressive attitude, which means let's focus on what's emerging. Let's focus on where things are moving forward. But we also know that some people need to go back into childhood to be able to repair something, to be able to understand something that was tripping them up. So here the unconscious is giving her this view of the fullness of the divine child, I think, the fullness of the inner child, and that she is able to access that, one, by humbling her ego and realizing I can't do this by myself, and then this very sincere attitude of looking towards the transcendence. And then I think she's gifted with this image that there's something in the childhood, perhaps a time of fullness, a time where she was whole, perhaps before some other kinds of traumas or difficulties happened, and that remembering those times when she was full as a child could be medicinal in some way.
And I'm thinking, too, of the serendipity of how we just discussed Daedalus and Icarus and flying. And here we have a dream that starts out with flying, and she comes down. She comes down from this, as you call it, transcendental place and lucid dreaming. And I'm even making a parallel with the exotic dancing because it's dramatic and there's music and movement. And she comes down to the children's book and a simple truth and the humbling, as you say, asking for help. And I'm contrasting it with her goal of nursing, caring for people. It's a hands-on profession in a way that is a real polarity from exotic dancing, of entertaining people. And she wants to be able to care for people and heal people as a nurse. It's very grounded, very human, and it has some of that, the religious attitude in it of meaning and a greater purpose and service.
It also feels to me like the dream might be compensatory to where she is, because she says, that it's been a real rough semester. She's been feeling overwhelmed, stressed, and depleted. And the dream, is not without its frustration, but there is this kind of lysis at the end with just this phrase, fullness of round objects, that seems to be supporting her path and reassuring, actually.
There's an element also in the dream that I think is worth bringing up, is the idea of the transcendent function in general, that it's when she feels thwarted and begins crying and feels frustrated, that's really the peripeteia, that's the changing point in the dream. Because prior to that, in a sense, the ego is very competent, it has a kind of supergirl quality, but it's in this way of being thwarted, that then the ego has to turn to something else other than her own ego potential.
Yeah.
She has to turn to a deeper source to resolve it. And as Jungians, we look for that frustrating moment where the ego has to cede control. And then ideally something in the unconscious, in the best circumstances, rises up to present a symbol which helps negotiate the tension, helps lead another step forward, which is this kind of extraordinary book title.
That's really, really beautiful, Joseph. And I think that's just right. And it reminds me of what often happens in fairy tales, which is the shift happens when the hero or heroine has nothing else to do and dissolves into tears. That's often where the plot shifts.
So even though I think the dreamer is feeling, of course, anxious and overwhelmed pursuing this career change, and I think that the challenge of going back to school to be a nurse is probably part of that crying frustration, because so much is required that perhaps she hasn't experienced in many years. But the dream is reassuring her, I think, that something in the unconscious is responding to her distress and her struggle, and is offering her, at least at the level of feeling, and perhaps even more deeply, that there's help. There's something else that's capable of responding inside of her.
Mm-hmm. That's really lovely.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.